I'm going to get back to what I talked about in the previous video, just about responding to Thunderfoot's video about all you need to know about the Brexit, as he calls it. I wanted to mention that on Twitter, he's been trying to compare the person who killed the member of parliament to the Orlando killer, saying that there's just as much tie between this person and the Brexit campaign as there is between the Orlando shooter and radical Islam. First of all, there's no evidence that this guy was involved in the Brexit campaign in any way whatsoever. He may have heard a Brexit argument or something that he bought into, but there's no evidence of him being a member of any political organization. People who knew him say he didn't talk about politics. The fact that someone who had pretty clear psychiatric problems latched on to a political argument one way or the other does not do anything to show that that's a result of that political argument. There's no reason to believe that he couldn't have just as easily agreed with some Remain argument and thought that people who are in favor of Brexit are horrible racists who don't care about the interest of the UK and they want to harm the economy and all these other things. He could have latched onto that and killed someone just the same. Or another argument I made was, if there were no Brexit campaign at all, he still probably would have gone and killed somebody because he was having severe psychiatric problems, and the reasonable part of his brain that was left went and tried to get help not long before he went and did this. So there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't have been having the psychiatric problems when he was having them if there were no election going on whatsoever. There's so many bad analogies to this. On September 11th alone, there were 3,000 people killed by radical Islamic terrorists. The Orlando was 50 more people killed by radical Islamic terrorists. San Bernardino was several more people killed by radical Islamic terrorists. Do you really think the same percentage of people would be saying not all BNP if BNP voters in the UK were doing this to people? And the BNP was always a very small fringe party in the UK, like Muslims are a very small part of people in the United States. And I know that the September 11th terrorists were not Americans, and one of the San Bernardino terrorists was not an American, but they came to America and spent time here before they committed terrorism. The percentages are valid, and as I also pointed out, the percentage of people who support Brexit is roughly half of the UK population, just like the percentage of people who are men are roughly half of the UK population. If some feminists, and Thunderfoot argues with feminists all the time, if some feminists said, this guy is emblematic of all men, would that be a good argument? Because he happens to be within a group that comprises 50% of the population? I don't think it would be. And I don't think Thunderfoot would be saying it. That's a good argument, or that's a reasonable argument. But once again, he's grasping for whatever straw he can find. I'm going to get back to the discussion of Thunderfoot's video that I was responding to. The next point is interesting because he talks about immigration, and he basically makes a libertarian sort of free market comment that people will move around because of the free market, which isn't really reality. I mean, it's the fact that there's a minimum wage in Romania that is about 1/5 the minimum wage in the UK is obviously going to have the tendency of pulling people from Romania. Assuming the person has a valid Romanian passport, they're allowed to settle in the UK to look for work there. They don't need to have work up front. They just show up with their passport. They're allowed in. It's not quite as easy to start getting job seeker allowance and child benefit and things like that, but those are things that are potentially available. That kind of contradicts what I was talking about earlier with the barriers to trade to countries outside of the EU. What about the free market there? So, if the UK really wants a free market policy, and I would think that would be something that would be helpful. They can opt not to have the external tariffs that the EU has. So it's not just you can reduce tariffs on your own. You don't have to have the World Trade Organization tell you to, or you don't have to have a completed arrangement with another country. You can just lower the tariffs on your own if you want to, or you can, it can be as simple as you agreeing to lower the tariffs and the other country agreeing to lower tariffs to your goods. All of a sudden, the free market doesn't matter then. It also doesn't matter if the free market prefers somebody from India to somebody from Poland. One of them is easy to relocate to the UK, and I don't mean distance. Assuming there's we talked about doctors earlier. Let's say there's an Indian doctor and there's a Polish doctor, and they're both willing to buy the ticket to London, even though the ticket from New Delhi or whatever to London's more expensive. Not that a plane ticket is going to stop somebody from hiring a really good doctor, but anyway, just making it all things being equal. There's all these other things that Thunderfoot doesn't seem to care about the free market, but he thinks it cares about the free market and that issue. So, I just think that's another kind of ad hoc argument that comes up. It's not arguing from principles and deductive reasoning. It's just making whatever argument seems readily available to support the predetermined conclusion. There's also a big issue with the free market. I mentioned agricultural subsidies briefly, that the EU does all these things to favor some countries producing some goods over other countries producing other goods. Italians are making wine that's just as good as French wine. The French people might get jealous and they might expect certain subsidies for their wine to give them an edge over the Italian wines that are trying to undercut them. So that's one issue. There's another issue that instead of the UK just controlling its own territorial waters and the fish therein, it's a multinational deal. I think the EU even allows other countries from outside the EU to come in and get some of the fish, limited to 20% of the value of the fisheries. But 20%, even if it's 50%, that's a big difference from 100%. And there has been massive damage to the UK ability to fish, and they actually paid fishermen to destroy their boats so that they didn't fish as much. That's not what the free market does. Sorry for the Stefan Molyneux reaction there. He has some Brexit videos as well, by the way. He brings up a couple of other things, and they're not arguments for leaving. He talks about his father who passed away, and that's a sad thing. And apparently his father was being cared for by the NHS, and that's an example of the UK government not being so great. And I'm not going to say that the NHS is a great system. I would not want a similar system to be implemented here, but I do have compassion for people like that, and I think as long as there is an NHS system, it should be run well. One thing that would help it to be run well is for there not to be so many immigrants from the European Union. Even if the government numbers are correct, which there's a good chance they may not be, that it's 330,000, something like that, per year coming in, but only about half of them are from the EU. So even if you cut the number in half, and obviously the government apparently hasn't done as much as it can to keep the numbers down from outside of the EU, but governments change, and I'll get to that. But it would work a lot better if there were fewer patients that had to deal with. I didn't really understand the details. His father had some kind of digestion issue, and there were valves and shunts and things like that, and they were being allowed to become infected, and Thunderfoot actually shared some words of his father, saying that's not something that should happen in a hospital. That should be a place where you're safeguarded against infections like that. But like I'm saying, I think if you reduce the numbers of people, and you're talking about well-off people, there's still a small percentage, but there's a percentage of people in England that can afford private health care. So we're not talking about those people. We're talking about the regular people who move there or who already live there. So if you can relieve the numbers, that would allow more ability to make sure the proper safeguards are in place. That would also make it so that people can get appointments sooner. I've heard that in some areas it takes a few weeks to get an appointment. If you're sick, especially if you're an elderly person and you're sick, and there might be something that they can help you with in a couple of days, but 3 weeks later, if you're 75 years old and not in great health, and you have a sudden onset of an illness, you might not make it 3 weeks. Or it would make it easier for them to have cancer treatments. They have very low cancer survival rates. So that would all help. The cheap Remain response to that is, well, we get doctors and nurses, but I'm not gonna. I don't know this, but my impression is there are plenty of doctors that you can get that are willing to move to England that are not in the EU. So a lot of them are foreign born, and that's fine, but you're not really dependent on the EU for that. And no one is talking about singling out a country and saying nobody from that country, even if they're a doctor, can move here. They're not talking about that, especially not one of the EU countries. So that's not an issue. The Leave side is going to continue to bring in all the doctors and nurses that they want to, or they're advocating that the government bring in all the doctors and nurses that might be needed. I don't know why more doctors and nurses aren't being trained, but again, that's a specific short-term government issue. This wasn't at the end, but this was mentioned at a couple different points. He talked about the Scottish referendum and David Cameron, and there's one thing that the Leave side of this referendum and No side, which is the equivalent of the Remain in the United Kingdom side of the Scottish referendum, is that the government in Westminster will continue to be the sovereign entity, and that when you aren't happy modernly, you change the members of Parliament, and the majority of the Scottish people want to continue that. They don't want Holyrood to be sovereign, although there are several areas that they're allowed to make decisions instead of the Westminster Parliament, but they want that to continue to be the main power center, to be the Westminster Parliament. And that's also what the Leave side wants. But instead of the alternative being the Holyrood Scottish Assembly, the alternative is the European Commission. They don't want the European Commission to start functioning as the head of state, or functioning in lieu of the head of. I mean, obviously the Queen is technically the head of state, but the Prime Minister is the person who carries out what's called Her Majesty's government. So, it's not about being a big fan of David Cameron. Most people in Scotland are not big fans of David Cameron, but they want the Prime Minister, they want all the members of Parliament to assemble in Westminster, and depending on what their makeup is, that decides who the Prime Minister is. They want that process to continue. They don't want some other entity to fill that role. And, David Cameron is a short-term issue. One thing is, if you don't want David Cameron to be the Prime Minister, vote leave. He'll have egg on his face. He'll look like an idiot. I mean, he already does look like an idiot in my humble opinion, but, I'm not a British citizen, so he doesn't look like any more of an idiot than Obama, but that's another topic. There's a good chance that he will be pushed out if he loses this, because he's staked so much on this, and I don't think a lot of people on the Leave side take him seriously. And if that side's victorious, I don't think he has a credible mandate. And he's also said that he'd back off a number of the government commitments on pensions and things like that, which that was part of what he ran on. I'm not a big fan of the BBC's Andrew Neil, but he said, how is this a legitimate government? How is this tenable if Leave side prevails? So if you want to at least make things difficult for David Cameron, vote Leave. But obviously that's a short-term thing, even if David Cameron hangs on until the next election, which he said he wouldn't run for Prime Minister again the next election. But for all we know, he might remain Prime Minister and just say, if George Osborne or whoever else, or Theresa May or one of those people, he might just say they'll be the Prime Minister if the Conservatives win in 2020, but I'm staying until the election. But anyway, that's going to be a maximum of 4 years from now. 4 years is only a small part there, versus continually integrationist, which I think is a better word than federalist European Parliament. And actually, in the comments to that video, I discussed that with somebody, that the impression some people have is the European Commission is essentially like the cabinet, which is not correct. It first of all, up until the last elections, which were in 2014. I can't believe it was that. I can't believe it was 2 years ago. But anyway, the last elections were in 2014, and that was the first time that the EU Parliament got to vote on who the president of, at least in my understanding, that was the first time the EU Parliament got to vote on who the president of the European Commission was. But how it worked was the Council of Ministers got together and recommended a candidate for a vote, and I believe he had to get a majority of the Parliament, and the largest group, albeit nowhere near a majority, was the EPP group, which they call it Federalist, but I don't like that word, because Federalist means to me that each subsidiary entity stays within their proper role, and that's also my understanding of what Federalist means in Germany and some other states, is that it's not just everybody all lumped together. There's still some local competencies of specific issues, like the states in the United States. Not every policy area is dictated by the federal government. So anyway, I'm just gonna say integrationist. They call it center right, but it's left compared to the United States probably. But it's a very integrationist group. There are no parties, at least no parties that have ever gotten anyone elected to anything, that are part of that group in the United Kingdom, which is part of the reason the United Kingdom government was not a big fan of that party's representative, which was Mr. Juncker, becoming the president of the European Commission. And then how it worked, it wasn't everybody get together and vote on who you want to be the president. It was the Council of Ministers, which is basically either the prime ministers of the countries or their direct delegates, making a decision to recommend a person to be president. So it was, my understanding is that the question to the European Parliament was, do you want Jean-Paul Juncker to be the president of the European Commission, yes or no? And the majority said yes. I suppose if a majority had said no, maybe they would have recommended Martin Schulz, who was the leader of the second largest group, which is the Social Democratic group, which the Labour Party is a part of, which I can't imagine the Conservative Party would have preferred him, but or maybe they would have stayed with the same group, and somebody else from the EPP group would have taken that place. But regardless, none of the elected MEPs were part of that group, and none of the candidates for MEP that had any chance were part of that group. But I believe there was actually a party. I don't know if this was across England or just in a couple specific areas, that something about the four freedoms that gave people an option to vote for EPP, but that was not not a party that's ever won anything. The UK voted against it in the Council of Ministers, and they lost. I believe it was 25-2 or something like that. I heard a speech from Nigel Lawson, who used to be a cabinet minister. I forget which office he was. I think he was in a couple different offices. I think he might have been the finance minister, and he left in 1989 or something like that. I believe he was the one that said there were 72 issues where they the UK objected to something in particular, and they were outvoted all 72 times. But generally, if there's some unique UK problem that they dissent, something that's going to be further into integration, hardly anyone joins them. So I think I'm going to do another video just based on a couple of other things arguments I've seen in other videos. I use YouTube video just because that's an easier way of getting news and information from the UK. We don't get any in-depth coverage of these things in the United States. Like, I'm sure people in the UK are more informed about our presidential election just by turning on the television than I would be informed about anything going on in the UK by turning on my television. Unless there's another attack like 7/7 or something like that, then that's something that we would have covered in depth. But as far as Brexit and general elections and European elections, it's very, very superficial. So I think that pretty much covers it. One other thing about the deck being stacked against the UK when they object to something. Only the UK and Denmark are outside of the Eurozone. So if there's some interest that they want to promote the Eurozone, even if it's going to be something negative for the UK and Denmark, it's pretty clear the UK and Denmark are going to be outvoted. There might be some kind of situation where maybe the Euro wants to do something to help out Southern Europe, and maybe Denmark and the UK can align with Northern Europeans to veto that. or maybe there's some condition Northern Europe wants to place on Southern Europe, and they can agree. But if it's something that is designed to favor the Eurozone as a whole, it's pretty clear that the UK is not going to be able to have much influence on that. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted this video to be responding to the Thunderfoot issues. The next video will cover some other things. Please check out the links I'm providing, and I'll talk to you next time.